Have you ever wondered what separates a brilliant decision from a mistake that can ruin an entire life? Because when we look at the biggest success stories in the world, we usually only see the ending. We see the billions, the headlines, the awards, the recognition. What we rarely see are the sleepless nights, the silent risks, the moments when everything could have fallen apart. Today's story is about a man who had already achieved everything. Most people spend their entire lives chasing money, status, security, a comfortable life for his family. From the outside, it looked like he had won, but despite having everything, he was willing to risk it all for a single opportunity, a decision that could make him a business legend or leave him with absolutely nothing. But before we get into the story, make sure to subscribe if you enjoy real stories about success, failure, power, money, and the decisions that changed lives forever. And if you enjoy this type of content, hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you might think. Now, let's begin. Imagine spending decades climbing to the very top of your industry, every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice finally paying off. You wake up each day knowing you've made. That's exactly where this CEO found himself. He wasn't just another successful executive. His name carried weight. People listened when he spoke. Companies wanted to work with him. Investors trusted him. His reputation had been built over years of smart decisions and consistent results. From the outside, his life looked almost perfect. His home was the product of decades of hard work. His finances were solid. His investments continued to grow. His family enjoyed a level of financial security that most people only dream about. For many, this would have been the finish line, the ultimate goal, the point where you stop taking risks and start protecting everything you've built. If someone had asked what he should do next, the answer would have seemed obvious. Play it safe, protect his wealth, enjoy the rewards of a lifetime of work. But there was one problem. He couldn't stop thinking about the future. While everyone around him was celebrating the present, he was obsessed with what was coming next. He spent countless hours studying markets, analyzing trends, searching for patterns that others couldn't see. It became an obsession. Even when everything in his life was going right, his mind was already searching for the next opportunity, the next disruption, the next breakthrough, the next big thing. And during one of those endless hours of research, something caught his attention. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a small shift happening quietly beneath the surface of the market. Most people ignored it. Most companies didn't even notice it. Industry experts weren't concerned. But he saw something different. The deeper he looked, the more convinced he became. What appeared to be a minor change was actually the beginning of something much bigger, a transformation that could reshape an entire industry. The opportunity was enormous, the kind of opportunity that only comes around once in a generation. If he was right, it could multiply his wealth beyond anything he had ever achieved before. It could cement his legacy for decades. It could make history. But there was another side to the equation. If he was wrong, the cost would be devastating. He wouldn't just lose money. He would lose credibility. He would lose the reputation he had spent years building. He could lose the financial stability that had taken a lifetime to create, and worst of all, he could put his family's future at risk. For the first time, he found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. On one side was security, and on the other was possibility. On one side was everything he had already achieved. The other was everything he might still achieve. Most people would choose security without hesitation. Most people would walk away. But as you're about to see, he wasn't most people, and without realizing it, he was standing at the edge of the most dangerous decision of his entire life, a decision that would start a journey with no turning back. The biggest disruptions in history rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with flashing lights or front-page headlines. Most of the time, they begin quietly, so quietly that almost nobody notices them. And that's exactly what happened here. While the market continued operating as usual, and major companies kept doing what they had always done, this CEO started noticing something different. Small signals, Tiny shifts, subtle changes hiding beneath the surface. Individually, they didn't seem important. Most people would have ignored them completely, but when he connected the dots, they told a very different story. Story about change, a story about opportunity, story that had the potential to reshape an entire industry. It started during his research. He spent hours digging through reports, tracking consumer behavior, studying emerging trends, and watching young companies enter the market. The deeper he looked, the harder it became to ignore what he was seeing. Something was changing, slowly, quietly, but inevitably. While his competitors were focused on next quarter's earnings, he was trying to understand what the world would look like 10 years from now. And that difference in perspective changed everything. What others saw as a stable market, he saw as a system on the verge of disruption. What others called security, he called complacency. And what others dismissed, he believed could become the greatest opportunity of his career. There was only one problem. An opportunity means nothing if nobody else believes in it. And at that moment, nobody did. When he started pitching the idea to investors, the reactions were discouraging. Some listened politely, others nodded along. A few even seemed interested. But by the end of almost every meeting, the answer was the same. No investors argued that the market was already mature. They claimed consumer behavior would never change enough to support his vision. They believed the risk was simply too high. To them, this wasn't a revolution. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. Then came the consultants, experienced professionals who had spent decades analyzing businesses, markets and economic trends. If anyone could validate his vision, surely it would be them. Instead, they delivered more bad news. Their reports highlighted obstacles. Their forecasts emphasized risk. Their projections painted a troubling picture. Many concluded that the odds of success were simply too low. Some even suggested that moving forward would be reckless. But the toughest criticism didn't come from investors, and it didn't come from consultants. It came from the people closest to him. Friends who had known him for years started questioning his judgment. Some genuinely believed he was making a mistake. Others thought success had clouded his decision-making. One question kept coming up again and again. Why risk everything when you've already won? And honestly, it was a fair question. After all, he had already achieved what most people spend a lifetime chasing: financial freedom, professional respect, a secure future. So why risk it? Why walk away from certainty? Why chase something that nobody else seemed able to see? It wasn't an easy question to answer, but every time he looked at the data, his conviction grew stronger. Every time he studied the market, he found more evidence pointing in the same direction. Every time he tried to convince himself to walk away, he discovered another reason to stay. It felt like assembling a puzzle that nobody else could see yet. One piece at a time, every piece fit, every connection made sense. And with each new discovery, ignoring the opportunity became harder, not easier. Still, the pressure was building. The rejections kept coming, the doubts kept growing, and with every closed door, the distance between his vision and reality seemed to get bigger. There were moments when even he began questioning himself. What if everyone else was right? What if he was reading the signals incorrectly? What if he had confused hope with reality? The thoughts kept returning, again and again, but they never lasted for long, because every time he went back to the data, the research, and the trends, the same conclusion emerged. The change was coming. Maybe not that month, maybe not even that year, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would change everything. The problem was that nobody wanted to wait long enough to find out. Investors wanted immediate returns. Consultants wanted predictability. The market rewarded certainty. But the truth is, the greatest opportunities almost never look safe in the beginning. In fact, that's usually why so few people recognize them. While everyone else was focused on the world as it was, he was focused on the world as it would become. A future that didn't exist yet. A future that, at the time, looked like nothing more than an unlikely idea. An idea that nobody took seriously. But very soon, that idea would force him to make a decision that would change his life forever. Belief is powerful, but there comes a point when believing in an idea stops being about vision. and starts demanding real sacrifice. For this CEO, that moment had finally arrived. For months, he did everything he could to find support. He pitched investors, built business plans, attended meetings, created financial projections, presented research, explained his vision over and over again, dozens of conversations, dozens of opportunities, dozens of chances for someone to say yes, but the answer never changed. Numbed at investors thought the risk was too high. Banks refused to offer favorable terms. Investment funds preferred safer opportunities. One by one, the doors began to close, until eventually, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If he wanted to turn this vision into reality, he would have to do it himself. It was a realization that changed everything. Because he was no longer making a decision about a company, he was making a decision about his family's future. For weeks, he wrestled with the choice, walk away or go all in. And in the end, he made his decision. He wasn't quitting. If nobody else believed in the opportunity, then he would believe enough for everyone. At first, the sacrifice seemed manageable. He started with his savings, money he had spent years putting aside, money meant for important moments in life, retirement, security, peace of mind. But in his mind, he wasn't spending it. He was investing it. Making a calculated bet on something he believed had extraordinary potential. At least that's what he told himself. Then the months passed, and the money disappeared faster than expected. Expenses kept rising. New challenges appeared almost every day. Every problem required more resources. Every obstacle demanded more capital. What had once looked like a manageable investment was slowly becoming something much bigger. Soon his savings were no longer enough. That's when he faced a second decision, a much harder one. He began selling investments, stocks he had accumulated over years, assets carefully built to secure his family's future, the financial foundation of everything he had worked for. Each sale seemed small on its own, a transfer here, a liquidation there. But together they told a troubling story, a story his family was beginning to notice. The atmosphere at home started to change. The conversations became different, more cautious, more serious. The sense of security that once filled the house was slowly being replaced by concern. His wife watched it happen quietly. At first, she supported him. She knew his track record, she knew how smart he was, she had seen him make difficult decisions before, and she had watched those decisions pay off. But as the risks grew larger, so did the doubts. It became impossible to ignore what was happening. The family's wealth was shrinking, their financial reserves were being drained, and the business was still nowhere near delivering the results everyone had hoped for. That's when the hardest conversations began. Not in conference rooms, not in board meetings, but late at night, after the house had gone quiet, after the emails stopped, after the world went to sleep. No presentations, no charts, no optimistic forecasts. Just two people sitting together, trying to make sense of an uncertain future. And during one of those conversations, his wife asked a question, a simple question, but one that carried enormous weight. What if this doesn't work? The silence that followed said everything, because it was the one question he couldn't answer. He could explain the market, he could explain the technology, he could explain the strategy, but he couldn't explain the future. Nobody could. The truth was, there was a very real chance he could fail, a very real chance he could lose a significant portion of everything they had spent years building. And that terrified him, far more than he ever admitted, because losing money was one thing. Watching his family suffer the consequences was something entirely different. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his decision. He wasn't just an entrepreneur chasing an opportunity anymore. He was a husband, a father, the person responsible for protecting the people he loved most, and that responsibility followed him everywhere. Every meeting, every investment, every decision, every sleepless night. Yet despite all of it, something inside him refused to quit. Maybe it was confidence, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the belief that he was seeing something everyone else had missed. Whatever it was, he kept moving forward. Each new investment increased the pressure. Each check he signed raised the stakes. Each decision made it harder to turn back. It was like crossing a bridge that disappeared behind him with every step. There was no easy way back, no guarantees, no safety net, only conviction, and a bet that kept getting bigger. What he didn't realize was that he was entering the most dangerous phase of the entire journey. Because from that moment forward, it wasn't just his money on the line, it was his reputation, his future, his family's security, and everything he had spent a lifetime building. Every big gamble has a moment when the excitement wears off. The early optimism fades. The ambitious projections stop mattering, and reality finally sends the bill. For this CEO, that moment arrived much sooner than he expected. In the beginning, he told himself the struggles were normal. Every startup faces obstacles. Every disruptive idea encounters resistance. Success just takes time. At least that's what he kept repeating to himself. But as the months passed, something became impossible to ignore. Nothing was improving. Customers weren't arriving fast enough. Sales remained far below expectations. Revenue wasn't even close to supporting the business. Meanwhile, expenses kept climbing, and they weren't climbing slowly. Every month brought new costs, new hires, new investments, new problems demanding immediate solutions. Money was leaving the company far faster than it was coming in. Soon, opening the financial reports became something he dreaded. Because every report told the same story: more expenses, more losses, more pressure. The situation was becoming dangerous, and deep down, he knew it. But the real problem wasn't just financial. The consequences were beginning to spread throughout the entire company. At first, the employees believed in the vision. They had bought into the dream. They trusted the CEO. They believed they were building something revolutionary. But dreams need results to survive, and the results simply weren't showing up. Slowly, confidence began to fade. First came the questions, then came the concerns, then came the rumors. Employees started wondering whether the company actually had a future. Some quietly updated their resumes. Others began exploring new opportunities. A few simply lost motivation altogether. The energy that had once fueled the team was disappearing, and the CEO could feel it. Every meeting felt heavier. Every presentation required more effort. Every motivational speech sounded less convincing than the one before it. Then things got worse. Business partners started pulling away. Companies that had once shown interest suddenly stopped returning calls. Suppliers demanded additional guarantees. Potential investors vanished after the first conversation. Little by little, people began treating the company like a lost cause. As if failure wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a certainty. And then came the criticism. At first it was subtle, a comment here, a skeptical remark there, quiet observations from competitors and analysts. But before long, the criticism started spreading. Rumors began circulating throughout the industry. Some claimed the CEO had lost touch with reality. Others said years of success had inflated his ego. Some argued he had become so convinced of his own brilliance that he could no longer see the obvious. The comments spread quickly. They're burning cash. The idea never made sense. He should have walked away months ago. His ambition finally caught up with him. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the words found their way to him. They always did. And once they reached him, they stayed. Because there was something especially cruel about those criticisms. Many of them sounded reasonable. The evidence was right there for everyone to see. The company was struggling. The money was disappearing. The promises remained unfulfilled. The longer things went wrong, the harder it became to defend his decisions. For the first time in years, his confidence started to crack. He still believed in the vision. He still believed in the opportunity, but he no longer believed with the same certainty. Doubt began showing up everywhere during meetings, on business trips, late at night when he tried to sleep, and every doubt led back to the same terrifying question: what if they're right? It was a question he desperately tried to avoid, but it kept coming back, again and again and again, until it became impossible to ignore. Maybe he had misread the signals. Maybe he had confused conviction with stubbornness. Maybe he had risked everything for an opportunity that never truly existed. Those thoughts followed him everywhere. Every day, every night. And for the first time in a very long time, he began considering something that once felt unthinkable. Failure. Not a setback. Not a temporary loss. Real failure. The kind that destroys careers. The kind that erases reputations. The kind that changes lives forever. The thought alone was enough to keep him awake at night, because this wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. He had invested money, time, energy, credibility, but most importantly, he had asked other people to believe in him. His employees, his partners, his family, they had all followed him because of his vision, and if everything collapsed, there would be nobody else to blame. That realization hit harder than any financial loss, and that's when the pressure reached its peak. The market was against him, the numbers were against him, public opinion was against him, and for the first time even his own mind seemed to be turning against him. What he didn't know was that the darkest part of the story often comes right before things begin to change. And while everything seemed to be moving toward disaster, something was about to happen, something that would completely change the direction of this story. There's a part of every great business story that rarely makes it into the headlines. News articles talk about profits, documentaries focus on achievements, books celebrate victories, but very few people talk about the nights when everything feels like it's falling apart. Very few people talk about what happens when a leader is left alone with his thoughts. No applause, no encouragement, no reassurance that the sacrifice will ever be worth it, and that's exactly where this CEO found himself. During the day, he played the role everyone expected him to play. He attended meetings, talked to employees, presented strategies, projected confidence. He did everything a leader is supposed to do. But at night the story changed. The phone stopped ringing. The emails stopped coming. The house went quiet. And for the first time all day, there was nowhere left to hide. He was alone with the one thing he couldn't escape, his own mind. Lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, he replayed every decision he had made over the past months. Every investment, every hire, every meeting, every risk, over and over again. Searching for the moment he might have gotten it wrong, searching for some clue that could explain why everything was going off the rails. But the more he thought, the more questions appeared, and the fewer answers he found. What haunted him most wasn't the possibility of losing money. Money can be earned back, businesses can be rebuilt, fortunes can be recreated. What truly terrified him was something much bigger, the people who had trusted him, his family, employees who had left stable jobs to join his company, partners who believed in his vision, people who had invested their time, their careers, and their hopes in his leadership. If everything collapsed, he wouldn't be the only one paying the price, and that thought was almost unbearable. Night after night, the pattern repeated itself. Hours awake, unable to sleep, unable to switch off his thoughts. While everyone else rested, he remained trapped in a silent war with his own doubts. Some nights, the weight felt overwhelming. The idea of quitting started appearing more often, not because he was weak, but because he was exhausted. Exhausted from the pressure, exhausted from the criticism, exhausted from fighting numbers that refused to improve, exhausted from carrying such an enormous responsibility almost entirely on his own. There were nights when walking away felt like the smartest choice, the safest choice, the most rational choice. He imagined shutting the project down, accepting the losses, protecting what remained, returning to a more predictable life. Maybe there was still time to avoid a complete disaster. Maybe that was exactly what a reasonable person would do. And to be fair, the critics reinforced that idea every chance they got. Their words echoed through his mind. You're being reckless. This opportunity doesn't exist. You should have stopped months ago. You're risking everything for a fantasy. Over time, he started asking himself questions he once refused to consider. What if they're right? What if all this conviction is nothing more than an illusion? What if confidence has turned into arrogance? What if I've been wrong from the beginning? Those questions followed him everywhere. And the worse things became, the more convincing they sounded. But there was something strange. Even during his darkest moments, there was still a voice inside him that refused to disappear. A quiet voice, a stubborn voice. Not certainty, not confidence. Not a guarantee of success, just a feeling, a conviction he couldn't fully explain. Every time he thought about quitting, something inside him whispered, "Not yet." Every time he considered walking away, he felt as though the story wasn't finished. As though one important piece was still missing, as though the market hadn't revealed its true direction yet, as though the worst chapter of the journey wasn't necessarily the final one, and that feeling kept him moving, even when logic suggested retreat, even when fear felt stronger than hope, even when every visible sign pointed in the opposite direction. Because deep down, he believed one thing: real change takes time, far more time than most people are willing to wait. And maybe the real test wasn't whether he could build a successful company. Maybe the real test was whether he could keep believing when there was no visible evidence telling him he should. That conviction became his lifeline. It got him out of bed every morning. It pushed him through another day. It kept him moving forward when almost everyone else had stopped believing. What he didn't realize was that he was getting closer to a turning point, a major one, because after months of setbacks, months of criticism, months of sleepless nights, the first signs of change were finally about to appear. Small signs, almost invisible signs, but signs that would completely change the course of this story. There's a moment in almost every great success story that most people never notice, a moment so subtle that it barely registers when it happens. It's not a massive breakthrough. It's not a headline-making victory. It's not a dramatic Hollywood-style turnaround. It's something much smaller, a tiny signal, a small piece of evidence that maybe, just maybe, all the sacrifice wasn't for nothing. And for this CEO, that moment had finally arrived. After months of losses, criticism, and constant self-doubt, something started to change. Not dramatically, not overnight. There was no sudden explosion in sales, no billionaire investor showing up to save the company, no miracle solution. The change began almost invisibly. It started with a single customer. At first, it looked like just another contract, nothing extraordinary, nothing capable of transforming the business on its own. But there was something different about this one. For the first time, someone truly understood what the company was trying to build. For the first time, a customer saw exactly what the CEO had been trying to explain for months. It was only one client, but it represented much more than a sale. It was validation, proof, evidence, a sign that maybe he wasn't as wrong as everyone believed. Then something else happened. A company that had previously rejected every opportunity to work with him suddenly reached out again. This time, the conversation felt different. The questions were different. The tone was different. The interest was genuine. What had once sounded absurd now seemed intriguing. Soon after, a partnership emerged. A small partnership, nothing capable of solving all his problems, but symbolically, it meant everything, because it proved something important. People were starting to pay attention. And when one person starts paying attention, others tend to follow. From there, small wins began to stack up. New contacts, new opportunities, new conversations. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't spending every waking hour putting out fires. Instead, he was beginning to see real possibilities for growth. The business was still far from healthy, very far. The challenges hadn't disappeared. Cash flow remained a constant concern. The pressure was still intense. But one crucial thing had changed. There was now evidence, small evidence, but real evidence. For the first time, the numbers started moving in the right direction. The decline slowed. Key metrics improved. Customers stayed longer. Interest in the product increased. Market acceptance began growing steadily. Individually, none of these changes seemed impressive. But together, they told a completely different story from the one the company had been living just months earlier. It was like watching a sunrise. Darkness doesn't disappear all at once. It retreats gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly you realize the entire landscape has changed. That's exactly what was happening. And perhaps the most surprising shift wasn't happening inside the company. It was happening outside of it. Investors who once ignored his emails started reaching out. People who had refused meetings now wanted conversations. Companies that had dismissed his proposal suddenly had questions. The same arguments that were once called naive were now being described as visionary. The same strategy that had been labeled reckless was suddenly being called bold. The same vision that had been mocked was now being praised as innovative. And that's when the CEO noticed something fascinating. The facts hadn't changed nearly as fast as people's opinions. What changed was perception, because the market has a funny habit. It rarely rewards people the moment they're right. First it doubts them, then it criticizes them, then it watches them, and only afterward does it recognize them. That's exactly what happened here. The narrative began to shift. Critics grew quieter, skeptics became curious, observers became interested, and people who once predicted failure started wondering whether they were witnessing something much bigger than they had imagined. But for the CEO, the greatest victory wasn't the new contracts. It wasn't the investor interest. It wasn't the growing momentum. His biggest victory was personal, because after all the sleepless nights, after all the criticism, after all the moments he came dangerously close to giving up, he finally had proof that his vision wasn't a fantasy. Maybe the road ahead was still long, maybe the hardest challenges were still waiting for him, but one thing could no longer be denied. He had seen something that others couldn't see, and now the rest of the market was beginning to see it too. What nobody realized, however, was that the real reward for his gamble was still ahead, because the next chapter wouldn't just change the company, it would change his life forever. In the end, this story stopped being about business, it stopped being about money, and it stopped being about a company. It became something much bigger, because once things finally started working, people only saw the outcome. They saw the growth, the partnerships, the investors, the recognition, the success. What they didn't see was everything that came before it. They didn't see how many times he came close to quitting. They didn't see the countless nights he spent awake, imagining the worst possible outcome. They didn't see the weight he carried while trying to protect a dream that seemed to be collapsing right in front of him. To the outside world, success looked inevitable, as if it had always been destined to happen. But he knew the truth. He knew how close he had come to failure. He knew there were moments when the entire story could have ended very differently. And maybe that's one of the biggest illusions behind every success story. When we look back at them, everything seems obvious, everything seems logical, everything seems predictable. The pieces fit together perfectly. But when you're living through the story, nothing feels clear, nothing feels certain. When he decided to risk his fortune, there were no guarantees, no certainty, no roadmap showing that everything would work out in the end. There was only risk, only fear, only a conviction that nobody else seemed to share, and that's exactly what made his journey extraordinary. Because the biggest opportunities rarely arrive disguised as safety. Most of the time, they arrive surrounded by doubt, surrounded by criticism, surrounded by uncertainty, and that's precisely why so many people miss them. They wait for the perfect moment. They wait for complete certainty. They wait for every answer before taking action. But the truth is that moment almost never comes. What this CEO discovered is something very few people truly understand. The greatest risk isn't always losing money. It isn't always wasting time, and it isn't always making mistakes. Sometimes the greatest risk is allowing fear to decide your future, because there's one question that can follow a person for the rest of their life. A question that's often harder to live with than failure itself. What if I had tried? What if? Those words don't disappear easily. They linger for years, sometimes for decades, and it was the desire to avoid that regret that kept him moving forward when everyone else told him to stop. Not because he was certain he would succeed, but because he believed some opportunities are worth pursuing, even when the odds seem impossible. His story reminds us that there is a place between failure and success. Difficult place, an uncomfortable place, a place where guarantees don't exist. where doubt and hope coexist every single day. That place is called uncertainty. And it's exactly where the most extraordinary stories are born. It's where visionaries are tested. It's where perseverance is challenged. It's where many of history's greatest achievements first begin to take shape. Maybe the biggest lesson from this story is actually quite simple. Not every gamble is worth taking. Not every risk should be embraced. But when you find something you truly believe in, something that still makes sense even when nobody else can see it, the courage to keep going can change everything, because the future often belongs to the people who stay in the game long enough to see it arrive. And that's exactly what this CEO did. He stayed, he endured, he believed, and in the end, he discovered that some of life's greatest rewards are hidden behind its hardest moments. And now I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done? Would you have made the same decision as this CEO? Would you have risked everything for an opportunity you believed in? Or would you have protected what you had already built? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your thoughts, especially on stories like this where there are no easy answers. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a like. It helps the channel more than you know and lets us know you want to see more stories about business, ambition, high-stakes decisions, and the people willing to risk everything to chase something bigger. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.